Amateur Traveler is in its 20th year now, but can you imagine if I had people on the show who had never been to the destination, but had just read about it or seen a movie about it? That wouldn't make any sense at all, and you wouldn't listen. We all know how important it is to receive advice from people who know a destination to get the most authentic local experience. And a great option for experiencing this is Explore Worldwide and their authentic small group adventures, led by local tour leaders, perfect for solo travelers who want to meet like minded people with a desire for adventure. I'm often an independent traveler, but two of my last three trips were with small group tours because they organize everything and it's a lot easier. If you want to recreate the tour I did to Malta, they have a Malta and Gozo Discovery Tour. I'm intrigued by one of their tours called A Taste of Sicily. The company again is Explore Worldwide, and visit exploreworldwide.com to learn more. And thanks to Explore Worldwide for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler. The nights are long, the days are short, and the weather is chilly to downright cold, depending on where you are. It's a good time to slip into a Quince iconic Mongolian cashmere sweaters, which start at only $50. You can treat yourself to everyday luxury at an affordable price with Quince. If you really want to dive into luxury, you can check out their leather handbags, washable silk shirts, and European linen sheet sets. Whatever you're looking for at Quince, all the prices are 50 to 80% less than similar brands, and they do that by partnering directly with top factories and cutting out the middleman. They only work with factories that use safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing processes. And of course, they use premium fabrics and finishes for that luxury feel in every piece. But you've already heard me rave about my Quince travel pants. Treat yourself this winter without the luxury price tag. Go to quince.com/traveler for 365-day returns plus free shipping on your order. That's QUINCE.com/traveler to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/traveler. And thanks to Quince for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler.
Got my bags packed, I'm on a roll. I'm heading out there and I'm ready to go. I'm looking real good in my passport photo. Oh, no.
Amateur Traveler, episode 667. Today, the Amateur Traveler talks about cities and national parks and temples, botanical gardens, and an orphanage for elephants as we go to the island nation of Sri Lanka.
Maybe not today.
Welcome to the Amateur Traveler. I'm your host, Chris Christensen. Let's talk about Sri Lanka. I'd like to welcome to the show Mike Powers of SmallOfTheRoad.blogspot.ca, and Mike has come to talk to us about Sri Lanka. Mike, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks very much, Chris. Great to be on the show.
And what is your connection with Sri Lanka?
Just as a tourist, really. Honestly, I didn't know much about Sri Lanka until just recently. And the more I learned about it, just kind of got more and more interested in it and decided to spend 2 weeks there while we were traveling for 3 months in Asia.
Excellent. You mean you didn't know anything except for the other version we did of Amateur Traveler in Sri Lanka?
Right? I actually did go back. I think it was episode 202. It was actually quite good. And I did use that for my planning, just so you know. It was a very good episode.
And why should somebody go to Sri Lanka?
Really what was appealing is there is so much variety in this country in such a small space. You know, it's got a lot of colonial history, starting with the Portuguese, the Dutch, the British. Certainly has influences from India and China as well more recently. A lot of incredible natural scenery and wildlife. Of course, it's got nice beaches. And to go with that, friendly people, very hospitable country, and actually quite affordable. You know, we stayed at places as cheap as $25 a night that were very nice. And then at the other spectrum, you can stay at literally what would be considered a 4 or 5 star resort here for less than $200, which is really incredible value.
Excellent. And what kind of itinerary are you going to recommend for us?
I think you typically suggest about a week. So In our case, we spent 2 weeks there, but you could easily condense it down to a week tour. You're going to be able to see an awful lot in a short space. And so we're going to take you through a route starting in Colombo, where you'll fly in typically, and head south to the beach area in the southwest area of the country, a little further south into the Dutch colonial town of Gaul, and on a couple hours beyond there to Yala National Park for a safari. And then we cut in straight into the center of the country, through the mountains, through the tea plantations, to an area called Horton's Plain National Park, and then on to Kandy, which is really the start of what they call the Cultural Triangle, and a lot of really incredible historical sites. And then back to Colombo. And we did spend a couple of days in Colombo, and I would say it's definitely worth spending a little bit of time there as well.
Excellent. Well, you started us there. Let's talk about Colombo first. What are we going to do there?
For us, we actually started in the beach area, but we ended up in Colombo, and it had a number of sites that are worthwhile. I think the Peta Market was our most popular for us. It's just this crazy kind of hectic place. A great place to start is at the Red Mosque, this red and white mosque right at the edge of the Peta Market. And you wander through these just narrow roadways and alleyways with all these interconnected buildings with little walkways winding through the buildings. And it's just full of these vendors just going about their daily work, really not catering to tourists at all. It's very much for the local population. And it's just a very chaotic. I mean, some of the shops we saw were just crazy. There was one spot where there were just literally two people sitting underneath a narrow little stairwell fixing phones for people and crazy stuff like that. So really, that was kind of an interesting place to wander for a bit. And we also stayed at the Gulf Face Hotel there, which I know on your first podcast was also talked about. And I can say it is still a great place to stay. It is just a very atmospheric, historic hotel dating back to about 1864. It actually was built before some of the other hotels that you may have heard of. The Raffles Hotel was actually built 35 years before that. So a lot of history there. In fact, they've got their own historian, if you can believe it, their own little museum in the hotel there.
I have run into that at a few different hotels, and it still catches me by surprise when a hotel whips out their historian. But it's something I've run into even at U.S. hotels.
And it does have a lot of interesting guests there. I mean, a lot of authors, Mark Twain, Arthur C. Clarke, Kipling, Hemingway, among others. So yeah, it's kind of just a neat place to hang out, and incredible views, too, out over the Indian Ocean, especially at sundown. In fact, they've got this little routine where a Sri Lankan guy comes out in a Scottish kilt with bagpipes, and they do this flag lowering ceremony, and everybody gathers around. It sounds a little corny maybe, but it's kind of fun. And it's definitely a nice spot to just sit on the veranda there and watch the sun go down.
And I did notice that it actually made the book 1,000 Places to See Before You Die. Now, I know that author, who is a very charming woman, by the way. We have met, but she does tend to like hotels a lot. So it's really 500 hotels that you should stay in before you die and 500 really cool places. But this is one of the hotels that she picked for that.
Yeah, it definitely makes the list. So that was Colombo. There's other things to see and do there, but I think maybe we could move a little further south to the beach area, which I know is popular, especially with a lot of the Europeans who go to Sri Lanka. We went to an area called Bentota Beach. It's on the southwest coast of Sri Lanka, and really you could pick any of the beaches along there. They're all quite nice. And we picked Bentota only because the resort we were staying at, which looked quite nice, happened to be there. We actually just really kind of took it easy. And
this was your adjust to jet lag portion of your trip.
That's it. I was just gonna say, you read my mind. It was planned to kind of overcome the jet lag. It was a long flight as well, so it was a nice place to rest up. And the other thing that we weren't really anticipating is we were leaving Canada in the wintertime. This was March in this year when we were leaving Canada. Minus 10, minus 20 degrees weather, and you're arriving in a tropical destination, and you think, I can't wait to get off the plane in this nice hot weather. But boy, it was quite the adjustment to the weather too. It was well over plus 30, and it was almost a little too hot for us, to be honest. So it was nice to be along the ocean and be able to jump in the ocean and cool down a little bit as we kind of acclimatized to the change there as well. That was Bentota Beach. Again, you could stay at any of the places there along the coast there. There are other things to do. As we drove along the coast, there are a lot of turtle sanctuaries and hatcheries you can stop at. Some of them will let you release turtles into the sea for a small fee. So something to consider if you have kids. Along the coast, there's also the traditional mask making area is around an area called Aryapella. And they've got a little museum there. Actually, I wouldn't maybe spend too much time in the museum. It's actually kind of this dusty, a little bit dark museum, but they do have a number of stores in the area around that museum where you can pick up a mask if you're looking for a souvenir. So that's worth a stop if you're looking for a souvenir.
And I can't picture in my mind what a Sri Lankan mask looks like.
They come in all sizes and shapes and all kind of grimacing faces. Anything you want to look at or that you can imagine, you'll find there. And we just picked one that we thought was kind of interesting. So it's definitely going to be a unique kind of handicraft local to Sri Lanka that's going to give you a reminder of the country. So that's what we're after.
And predominantly wooden masks?
Yeah, a lot of predominantly wooden masks. Yeah, okay. Absolutely. So on a little more of a somber note, you can also stop at the Tsunami Memorial. There's actually a couple of them, but the major one is around a town called Paralila, and you can't miss it. Right off the highway, there's this giant statue of the Lord Buddha marking the spot. And this town literally was quite devastated, lost about 2,500 people. You can still see a lot of the foundations, ruined foundations along the roadside. And equally, you can actually see a lot of people who built new homes right up to the coast again. But this, unfortunately, was also the site of the world's worst train disaster, with 1,500 people lost their lives when this train was literally just pushed right off the tracks by the tsunami.
Oh, okay. Not unrelated. Okay.
Yeah, and I'll forewarn you, too, there's a little photo museum that you can visit just to the entrance of this memorial. And some of the photos in that museum are quite graphic. So especially if you have kids, we weren't quite expecting it as we walked in. You may want to just be aware of that.
Okay.
The other thing that this area is known for is gemstones, and there's a lot of little operations you can stop at. We stopped at a family-run operation, and it's kind of neat to see how they mine the gemstones. They pull them up from a fairly shallow mine that's only about 30 or 40 feet deep. They wash it off and use a sieve to kind of collect the gemstones. So if you're interested in that as well, it's a great place to actually purchase gemstones in that area as well if you're looking for some jewelry.
And are there particular types of stones that they are known for?
The one that you can apparently only get in this area is called the Blue Moonstone that we had heard about as we were there. But there are all kinds. There's literally over about 50 different types of gemstones that they mine there, including things like ruby and sapphire and things that you're familiar with.
Okay.
Let's continue on the coast then. We headed down towards the south into the country to the historic Dutch town, colonial town of Gaul. And actually it was first a Portuguese town, come to think of it, before it became Dutch in the 17th century. But a lot of the remains there, or the historic ties, are more Dutch today. And it's built on this little peninsula that juts out into the Indian Ocean. And there's these giant ramparts that just surround the whole old part of the town running along the ocean. That's a great way to see the town, is literally just walk around the town. It takes maybe an hour or two, and you're going to see a lot of the sights along the way, passing, a historic lighthouse, this large clock tower that overlooks a well-known cricket stadium there. There's an old Dutch Reformed church from the mid-1700s, and then various remains from the fort and the military installations. There's a museum you can stop in at, the National Maritime Museum, which was quite good. It's housed in this old Dutch warehouse from the 17th century. And then the town itself is definitely worth spending a little bit of time in as well. It's a bit touristy, but it's got a lot of nice restaurants, places to stay both in the old town as well as just outside. I was mentioning the gemstones, and certainly there's a lot of gemstone shops. The one little shop that we came across that was kind of interesting to us was something called Embark, E-M-B-A-R-K. It's a retail store. They sell T-shirts and china and things of that nature, all themed around street dogs. So there's actually 12 of the, yeah.
I didn't know where you were going, but I wasn't expecting that.
Yeah. And there are literally 12 of these scattered around the country, and all the profits go to protecting street dogs. They do have a bit of an issue there, or challenge, with about 500,000 street dogs. My wife is a veterinarian, so we took a special interest in this. And in fact, we had purchased dog food, and as we were driving around the country, we were stopping quite frequently to feed these street dogs. So our driver was very good about that. He actually got into the kind of in the mood, and he was spotting dogs 100 meters off and slowing down for us. So it was kind of fun.
Well, and I'll put a link. They also have a volunteer, a nonprofit that is associated with the shop. So we'll put a link to that in the show notes.
Okay, and if you are there for more than a day or so, there's also some beaches close by. Just literally like 10 minutes away, you can grab a tuk-tuk for about a couple dollars to Unawatuna Beach is a popular one. We stopped there. It's a little bit more developed. A lot of restaurants that come right up to the sand. If you want something a little more, less developed, further down the road, there's a couple other beaches you can stop at. So easy to do a little day trip if you haven't already had enough beach time by now.
Okay.
Let's continue on then, if we can, along the southern part of the coast. About 2 hours further, you'll come to a place called Yala National Park. Mm-hmm. And this is a great place to go on safari. Now, honestly, you don't really think of Sri Lanka, I don't think anyways, when you hear the word safari, but you think of Africa, of course. So we went into this with really low expectations. We did spend 2 days there. We did 2 half-day safaris on the first day and a third half-day safari on the second day. And we were pleasantly surprised. I mean, we were actually pretty amazed. It was our first safari experience, so I can't really compare it to, say, being in Africa.
So it was the best safari you have ever been on.
It was the best. I can say that without a doubt. Just to give you a flavor of some of the things we saw anyways, we saw leopards, and it's certainly not guaranteed to see leopards, but apparently it has amongst the highest leopards per capita in the world, so we read. And we were lucky enough to see one, just sunning itself up on the rocks. We saw a few elephants, including some really large bull elephants with big tusks. And we saw a few water buffaloes. So, if you're willing to substitute a water buffalo for the African Cape buffalo, we actually saw 3 of the traditional big 5 animals that you'd see on an African safari.
Except you would be seeing Asian elephants.
Yes, and that's true too.
Okay.
But elephant is an elephant to me. But
It still counts.
And actually, probably the most rare thing we saw was the Sri Lankan sloth bear, of which there's only about 500 to 1,000 remaining. And even our guide got quite excited when we saw that. So we saw a lot of variety there. In fact, there are a lot of different birds, obviously, you can see there. We counted over 70 different animals and birds in the day and a half that we were touring. We saw a lot of hornbills, kingfishers, eagles, and hawks. The Sri Lankan national bird, which is the Sri Lankan jungle fowl, is kind of this very colorful, literally like a chicken wandering around in the forest. Looked a little out of place, but it was kind of interesting. So we did see a lot, and just literally every 5 or 10 minutes there'd be something new. And so we were very pleasantly surprised. I think, though, just to be fair, our guide said we saw probably more than just about any of the people that he's taken through there. So I think we just got really, frankly, quite lucky to see everything that we did. But even if we saw half of what we saw, it would have been very worthwhile. I would definitely encourage you to hire. In fact, you have to hire a guide to go into the park, and it really is a great way to help preserve that local environment. It's a very scenic area too. It's kind of the summit area with these large boulders that you drive through and rocky outcroppings, and kind of a mix of shrubland and forest with the periodic water tanks or these large reservoirs that they've got there. So very scenic area as well.
Okay. And by this time, we've made our way over to the eastern coast of Sri Lanka, having started in Colombo, which is 2/3 of the way down on the western coast.
Yep.
Okay.
The one last thing I'd mention about the park, too, is just the gates. There's 3 gates you can go through. There's one in the south, the middle, and the north. The south one can be quite busy from what I read. So we ended up going through the middle one. There were only literally 5 other vehicles versus I've heard or read that the south gate can have as many as 50 to 100 vehicles lined up there in the morning to go in.
Oh, wow.
So you might want to consider that middle gate.
Okay.
I think we can move on then if we want to cut into the interior now. And, one thing I should mention, Chris, is just as we're touring along here, in the 2 weeks we were traveling, we stopped at about 7 different destinations. And on average, each day's drive was only about 3 hours. So you're not doing a ton of drive time here.
Yeah, it looks like from Colombo all the way over to Yala, you're only talking about 4 hours or something like that.
Yeah, it's really pretty short distances. And the other thing that's, I think, worth mentioning, this country, for such a small country, has got 8 UNESCO World Heritage Sites. We were able to visit 7 of them. Just compare that to Vietnam, 5 times the size of Sri Lanka with 8 UNESCO World Heritage Sites as well. So you're definitely going to see a lot in some short spaces here. Anyway, we're heading now inland. We'll head up through the mountains and through the tea plantations towards an area called Hortons Plain National Park. And this was our second World Heritage Site that we stopped at.
Well, you didn't mention that the first one was Gaul.
The first one was Gaul, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. So we're heading up the mountains, incredible views out over the plains. And we stayed at a place up towards the top of the mountains, with just this incredible view out over the tea plantations, a couple of tea factories called Hill Safari Lodge, and a very inexpensive. This was only $25 a stay at this place. It was quite nice. And the one thing I'll mention is called Hill Safari Lodge, but it actually has nothing to do with safari. So I don't confuse anyone with that. I asked the owner why he called it Hill Safari Lodge. He just said you could go for a nice safari walk. So I think he was taking a little bit of liberty. You're not going to see leopards or elephants up here, but you are going to see some really nice scenery. And the real destination in this area is really Hortons Plain. It's a national park with a popular loop trail that takes you to this very steep drop-off called World's End. And it's about almost a kilometer high. So you really get an incredible view out over the Sri Lankan plains. And it kind of returns back along this little stream and past some waterfalls and little pools. So really nice hike. You see some wildlife in there as well. The Sri Lankan samba deer are pretty common in that area. We saw this giant squirrel up in the trees there as well, which is, like I say, just basically a very large version of what we would consider a squirrel here. The other thing I'd say here is just try and get there early. They suggest you arrive at the park by 8 a.m. because by the time you get to the World's End with that view, it's going to start to cloud up by mid-morning.
Okay.
And we had some incredible views when we got there.
Well, and you're already over 2,000 meters or over a mile up. So is it significantly cooler from down where you were when you were adjusting to the heat of Sri Lanka?
Absolutely, actually. And I'm glad you reminded me of that because it was pretty refreshing.
Sure.
I'm not real good with the heat, but there's a British hill station not too far from there. It's a popular destination for Hortons Plain as well. People will stay in this little town. It's got the old British colonial heritage associated with it. Nuera Elia, I believe it's pronounced.
Okay.
So it's a nice place to stay, but we actually just passed through and stopped in for lunch, and there's an old British hotel you can stay at there or have a meal as we did. And the temperature is very moderate up there, almost spring-like, I would say.
Okay.
The other thing that you'll probably want to do in this area is stop at a tea factory. We stopped at a couple. The one I'd suggest would be Dambethina Tea Factory. It was originally purchased by Thomas Lipton, of all people, in the 1800s. But he purchased a bunch of plantations in this area that were formerly coffee plantations, but because of the coffee blight, they converted them all to tea and kind of helped build his fortune through tea grown in Sri Lanka. And they've got, I think the tea factory there is really maybe a little bit more designed for tourists. They've got a lot of old equipment, some of it over 100 years old, that's still operational. So it's kind of neat to walk around and see the tea still being processed the way they had always done it in that area. And at the end, taste a bit of tea if you'd like as well.
Excellent. Let's take a break here and hear from a sponsor, and that's mytravelcreditcard.com. I think it's clear that if you've been listening to Amateur Traveler that I love travel, but I don't love paying for travel, or at least I don't love paying extra for travel. That's why each day I help pay for my travel just by buying my groceries, my gas, and my gadgets. For a number of years now, my wife and I have used travel credit cards for our daily expenses. Then every year, we reap the rewards by using the points we earn to pay for airline tickets and hotel rooms. We get extra benefits along the way, like airline credit cards that let us waive luggage fees and hotel credit cards that give us a free night a year. Travel cards we use let us avoid foreign transaction fees when we travel overseas, which also saves us money. We pay these cards off every single month, and that's the smart thing to do. That way, other people are paying for our travel instead of the other way around. If you don't know where to get started, you can go to mytravelcreditcard.com, and we've picked a small number of great travel credit cards that I personally recommend, including the best starter card. Right now, the card I reach for first is from Chase, but if I find better cards, then we'll update mytravelcreditcard.com with our best picks. So check it out and let me know where you go with your points.
We're going to continue on then through the interior, right into the heart of Sri Lanka to Kandy. This is the start of what they call the Cultural Triangle. There's a lot of historic sites in this area. In fact, there's 5 UNESCO World Heritage Sites, which we're able to visit. And Kandy is definitely worth a day or two if you have time. First stop I'd suggest would be the Temple of the Sacred tooth relic. It's very popular, especially with the locals, and in fact, not just from Sri Lanka, but Buddhists from around the world. Very atmospheric temple. It does house the tooth relic from the Buddha in a gold casket. You're not actually going to see the tooth, but you're going to see this gold-shaped stupa where it's stored. And, if you come at the right time, either dawn, noon, or later in the evenings, they have rituals that you can see performed. There's a hall just in behind the tooth with depictions of the history of the sacred tooth, how it passed through various kings from place to place over the years to its eventual home in Kandy. There's a royal palace there you can visit. There's the King's Audience Hall. And if you come in July or August, there's also a very popular festival called the Festival of the Tooth that you can take in as well. The town of Kandy, too, is worth just a walk around. There's a pretty scenic little lake that is right in the center of town. You can walk around, and very close to that lake as well as to the temple is the Kandian Art Association, where you can take in some traditional dancing, which we did in the evening. It's a really acrobatic show with you spinning discs, fire walking, fire breathing. So that's worth taking in for an hour or so. There's definitely some pretty large markets you can get lost in there, more for the locals with local produce and textiles and things of that nature as well. So lots to see in Kandy.
I was just looking up the Festival of the Sacred Tooth because I just can't imagine what that would be like. And my mind, of course, goes off into all sorts of possibilities. But it is a 10-day festival, it looks like, featuring dancers, jugglers, musicians, fire breathers, lavishly decorated elephants. A big thing.
We missed the elephants, so I don't know what happened there. Yeah, but it is definitely worthwhile. The other thing we did out of Kandy, because we actually spent 3 days there, we took a day trip down to something called the Pinawala Elephant Orphanage, which was run by the government. It was well worth a while. Again, my wife is a vet, and she felt that the elephants were really in quite good health. They had large enclosures, free-range enclosures that you could watch the elephants from, and they did also had them take them down to the riverside where you could watch them bathing in the river, and there was a lot of, actually it was more almost like a bit of a zoo experience. There were like a lot of people. There are a lot of, especially local school children who were taking that in.
So this is a place you can have a positive experience with elephants without the elephant riding, which...
Yes, exactly. Now, I will forewarn you, just on that point, as you're driving there, we did pass some smaller operations where you could ride the elephants.
Sure.
And my wife, again, being a vet, did notice just the health didn't quite seem as good. They were in small enclosures. They were chained. And I don't know if people recognize, but when you ride an elephant, typically they have to be trained with a lot of negative reinforcement. You might not see that while you're riding them.
Sharp, pointy
but just
things
be aware
and big
of
chains,
that. Yeah. And so that was a worthwhile day trip. And on the way back, we actually stopped quickly at the Royal Botanical Gardens just outside of Kandy. It's got some really nice orchid house, artificial cloud forest, a big palm avenue you can walk through. But the thing that was kind of neat were these, they had these large flying foxes or fruit bats. And literally, this was in the evening, there were thousands of them. I mean, it's just incredible. It reminded me of that scene in The Wizard of Oz with the flying monkeys just covering the horizon. So that was kind of a neat sight.
And just to get the scale of these, they really are like flying foxes, and they're quite large usually.
They are.
And I know when we saw them in Australia, my son and I were really taken with this. Was really cool. And my daughter and my wife were repelled, I think would be the appropriate term. Possibly horrified. But
I can believe it. So from there, we moved on into this so-called cultural triangle area. Sigiriya would be the big draw there, and for good reasons. If you're in Sri Lanka, in my mind, it really is a must visit. So we'll talk about that. But just on the drive out of Kandy, there are a couple other things I think are worth mentioning. One of the things about Sri Lanka is it's got a lot of history and a lot of little temples that are well over 1,000-year-old, just scattered around the country. So we did visit a few, and I not going to go into a lot of detail around all those, but you might want to consider stopping at a few if they're close to the road. And one that we did stop at was a little rock cave temple called Aluviharaya Rock Cave Temple, and I might be mispronouncing that a little bit, but it's just this little temple nestled in these large boulders that you wander through, and some very graphic scenes of sinners being punished in hell with various forms of torture. It was really quite gruesome and so untypical for what is typically kind of a tranquil Buddhist temple. It was a little different, which is why I mentioned this one. And you might want to be considerate if you have young children, although there were young school children marching through this, just seemed to be totally unfazed. I think we were a little bit more upset by it, but it was kind of a neat stop for a quick diversion. A little further along is the Dambulla Royal Cave Temple, and this is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And you can spend a couple, 2 or 3 hours here. You'll have to hike up about 20, 30 minutes, potentially in the hot sun to get to it, but it's well worth the hike. One of the things that I should mention about the Buddhist temples, too, is you will need to be covered, your shoulders and your knees. Mm-hmm. And as well, when you enter the temples, you have to take off your shoes and your hats. Okay. Just be aware, like some of these temples get, if you have to walk across these hot rocks, it is extremely hot. And you want to just make sure you keep your socks with you. Okay. We saw people who were dancing along, literally dancing around on these rocks without socks. And we kind of learned our lesson the hard way, too. But we had our socks by that time, and it was a little more reasonable. But you get to, anyway, this ledge that is quite hot, but it has an incredible view out over the plains. And there's a series of 5 caves that you walk through. And incredible paintings. I mean, just very vivid colors in really good condition, and well over 100 Buddha statues scattered around these caves. So it really is kind of a neat experience to walk through and just take in these caves and these paintings that are literally well over 1,000 years old.
Well, I'm seeing some of them 2,000 years old. Am I getting that wrong?
No, it dates back to I read the 2nd century BC. Okay. The complex itself is a monastic complex that, over 2,000 years old. Interesting. So quite an interesting site. And then from there, we ended up visiting Sigiriya we did a full day trip there. And this, again, is a must-see site. It's this, if you haven't seen a picture of it, just Google and take a look, but it's this ancient rock fortress. It dates back to about the 5th century. And it's just this rocky outcropping that literally sticks straight up out of the surrounding grounds with these 200-meter-high vertical cliffs going straight up. Great views from the top, but also some great views as you're approaching it from the ground. And there's a lot of interesting gardens that you walk through. You pass these water gardens, and then the trail takes you winding through these giant boulders, and the boulder gardens, they're called, right up to the base of the cliff where you reach the terrace gardens, and then you start your climb up this steep 200-meter cliff. One thing that I would forewarn you here is try and get here early in the morning as well, just because you're going to be in the shade as you're climbing up. The other thing is, I don't know much about wasps, but they had all these signs warning you about wasps as you're about to embark on this hike up the cliff. Don't make loud noises. And so, I don't know, maybe not being there in the heat of the sun might be a good thing. We never saw any early in the morning, so another reason perhaps for getting there a little bit earlier. And you're going to head up through the stairs, and there's a couple things you see on the way up. There's ancient frescoes that are in very good conditions on these overhangs that you can stop at and view. And then there's something, they call it the mirror wall. It's literally over 1,000-year-old, this wall with this polished plaster that has all this graffiti. Literally graffiti is as old as 1,000 years that's been captured on there. So you'll walk by that for probably about 100 feet or so. And then you're going to head a little further up to what they call the Lion's Paw Terrace. And this is another little plateau before you get to the very top where there used to be this lion built out of stones right at the base of this terrace. And you literally walk through these 2 remaining lion's paws, all that remains of this lion, to walk up to the very top of Sigiriya, where you then can walk around the old ruins of the royal palace. There's a large water tanker water hole with some smaller water gardens and other remains of the royal palace area. And this dates back again well over 1,000 years.
Yeah, it looks like about a little over 1,500 years old.
Yeah. So a lot of interesting history there. And there's a good museum at the base, too, that it is worth spending some time in, I should mention as well.
Excellent. And one of the UNESCO World Heritage Sites, I think you may have mentioned already, but... Now,
there are 2 more that I'll get to in a minute, but I just want to take a bit of a detour now and talk about where we stayed. It's about 20 minutes from Sigiriya, called the Heritage Kandalama Hotel. Okay. It's a fairly well-known hotel. It was designed by an architect, Jeffrey Bawa, who's a very well-known Asian architect from Sri Lanka. Forerunner, I guess, of the tropical modernism. I'm not an architect, but I can tell you that this hotel The whole concept is that it's kind of integrated with the local environment, and it really is. I mean, he built it in the side of this cliff overlooking a reservoir surrounded by forest, and he kind of built this framework that just a couple of feet surrounding the whole hotel where the vines and all the plants grow. So when you're looking at the hotel from a distance, it's literally just like a wall of green. It's really incredible. There's one little tunnel that leads you to the main sitting area that is designed to catch all the wind that's coming through. It's really a nice place to cool down. A really incredible site. In fact, we spent a fair bit of time just at the hotel itself because it really is a beautiful spot to spend some time. And it's also a great base to visit not just Sigiriya and Dambulla Caves, but also a couple other historic sites, which I'll touch on is Polonnaruwa and Anuradhapura, which are both ancient capital cities of Sri Lanka. Mm-hmm. Polonnaruwa is dating back to about the 10th century, so it's a little more recent. The ruins are in a little better condition. And our driver set us up with a local guide here who was quite good. We started at the Archaeological Museum, kind of got an overview of the history of this area, and then he took us through the Royal Palace remains, King's Audience Hall, and to what looks like a swimming pool, but they call them pakunas. It was literally where the king would spend time in the water. And further along would be the sacred quadrangle with a number of impressive buildings you can visit. There's some stupas there as well. And this giant stone slab we came across is literally about 800 years old, and it's just covered in inscriptions from the king at the time. But it measures about 27 feet long by 5 feet wide and 2 feet deep. And this giant stone weighed about 15 tons, and they literally dragged it about 100 kilometers away to its current location, probably losing elephants and the like. So quite an impressive site that we weren't expecting. And then Anuradhapura is also a capital city of Sri Lanka, but dating back a little further to about the 4th century up until the 10th century. And this site is a little bit more spread out, so we actually took bicycles from our guest house to tour around. And it has the more stupas, very large, or they call them locally dagobas, but these very large stupas are these Buddhist bell-shaped mounds that you can visit, one which contains remains of the Buddha, along with a 2,500-year-old tree that was planted from a branch taken from the tree that the Buddha gained enlightenment at. So that's a very popular site for the locals as well as the tourists. There is also a royal palace and ruins of monastic buildings and other sites you can visit around Anuradhapura as well.
Excellent.
From there, we're taking the coastal road back to Colombo, and again, a nice little compact for us 2 weeks, but you could easily do that in a week as well.
Well, and you're coming a long way, so 2 weeks, I'll give you 2 weeks.
Yeah, exactly. If you're coming all the way from Canada or North America, it's worth staying a little bit longer.
What surprised you with Sri Lanka?
I'll say one thing that surprised us was the speed limit signs. I mean, it was a little bizarre. They had literally 3 different signage that you would come across: 40 kilometer, 50 kilometer, and then 60 kilometers. Okay. And they would have a little picture showing a tuk-tuk and a tractor at 40 kilometers, buses and trucks at 50, and then automobiles and motorcycles at 60. And we were in a minivan, so I'm not quite sure where we fell, but I just never seen speed signs like that. And along the way as well, we kept seeing these cutouts of police officers holding a speeding gun. And, after we saw the first one, we were kind of onto it. I can't imagine, the locals being fooled by it, but we saw some silly road signs along the way.
Oh, that's funny. I think that you may have already answered my one thing that makes you laugh and say only in Sri Lanka.
Yeah.
Little wooden cutouts of police officers. You mentioned the restaurants, good restaurants. I can't remember which city you were talking about at the time. I didn't want to interrupt your flow. Are there a particular restaurant you would recommend or dishes we should try?
All right. So you might not like this answer, but they do have McDonald's in Sri Lanka. And they have this thing called the Chicken Big Mac, which I just had to try, and it was actually quite good. It's basically a Big Mac with chicken patties, so that was kind of interesting. But to your point, I think you're probably looking more for the local culture. Just some of the guest houses we stayed at, they often would serve hoppers in the morning. Now, there's a couple of styles. There's a bowl hopper, which is a bowl-shaped pancake made out of rice flour. It is very common in Sri Lanka, and they typically will fill it with an egg and perhaps some other ingredients of vegetables and the like. Or they also have string hoppers, which are also this rice flour that's more in the shape of spaghetti that they will often mix in with the curry. So that's something that if you're in Sri Lanka, you're probably going to try. It was quite good. I'd never had it before. I was pleasantly surprised.
Well, and I should say, I'm not too surprised about the chicken at McDonald's because having just been recently in India, north of there, of course, we walked past a McDonald's. I did not eat there, just for the record, in case anybody's keeping score. But there was no beef because of the Hindu population. And even in Sri Lanka, you still have about 12%, between 12 and 13% of people are Hindus. So it's just easier, perhaps, if you don't have beef on the menu.
Yeah, well, and they did have beef, but it was just I'd never seen a chicken Big Mac before, which was kind of unique.
Interesting. You're standing in the prettiest spot in Sri Lanka. Where are you standing? What are you looking at?
Can I be floating?
Yes, you can.
Okay. Well, this would take me back to the Heritage Kandalama Hotel and floating in their eternity pool, looking out over the Kandalama Reservoir, surrounded by the mountains and the forest, birds passing over as the sun's going down. And in the distance, you can see Sigiri. And that was a pretty special spot for us to just hang out and take it all in.
And what was the type of pool? It's an infinity pool, basically.
Infinity pool.
Infinity pools right, are the ones that look like they have no end. An eternity pool is one that makes you really pruny, I think, quite possibly. Excellent. I think that wraps it up, unless we have any other answers that you've got left over that I've run out of questions for.
We learned as we're driving around that every full moon is a holiday in Sri Lanka. A lot of things will shut down. So, and they can happen in obviously any day of the week. So just something to check before you head into Sri Lanka.
Good to know.
And the other thing would be bring lots of suntan lotion. We ran out and went hunting for suntan lotion. I guess locals don't really use suntan lotion. We went without as well ourselves because it was $60 for a bottle at the body shop. So we just kind of passed on that.
Okay. Excellent. Our guest again has been Mike Powers. And Mike, I don't think you have written up anything yet on this, but if you do, let me know. We'll put a link to that in the show notes. And thank you so much for coming on Amateur Traveler and sharing with us your love for Sri Lanka.
Great. Well, thanks, Chris. And thanks for all the great work you've been doing over the years with the podcast.
Oh, you're very welcome. In news of the community, I heard from Carla, who said, I started listening to your podcast a few months ago, and I generally enjoy them very much. I just listened to the episode about the Czech Republic. I was curious, being Czech myself. I found the episode good, but there were two things I found mistaken. Kutná Hora has so much more to offer than the Bone Church, and we Czechs do like skiing. Czech Republic is a fantastic place on earth, and I'd be willing to tell you more about it. Thanks so much, Carla. And I don't recall any reference to skiing, and I'm not sure which episode you listened to. We've got a couple different ones on the Czech Republic. The most recent episode was when we took a group to Prague, Krakow, and Budapest, and we did mention Kutná Hora in that one. But what I said was that I enjoyed actually the main church in Kutná Hora even more so than the Bone Church. The Bone Church is a little weird, but the main church there is just beautiful with some beautiful Art Nouveau stained glass windows from people who were in the same school as Mucha. And I actually have the Mucha window from the main cathedral in Prague as the backdrop for my desktop on my laptop because I like it so much. With that, we're going to end this episode of Amateur Traveler. Don't forget mytravelcreditcard.com. If you have any questions, send an email to host@amateurtraveler.com, or better yet, leave a comment on this episode at amateurtraveler.com. And thanks so much for listening.
I got to see one more cathedral. I got to sit in one more cafe.